The Apache Mountain War by Robert Howard. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Apache Mountain War by Robert Howard. Someday, maybe, when I'm old and gray in the whiskers, I'll have sense enough not to stop when I'm riding by Uncle Shadrach Polk's cabin and Aunt Tascosa Polk hollers at me. Take the last time, for instance. I ought to have spurred Captain Kidd into a high run when she stuck her head out in the winder and yelled, "Breckinridge! Oh, Breckinridge!" But I reckon Pap's right when he says nature give me so much muscle she didn't have no room left for brains. Anyway, I reined Captain Kidd around, ignoring his playful efforts to bite the muscle out of my left thigh, and I rode up to the stoop and taken off my coonskin cap. I said, "Well, Aunt Tascosa, how air you all?" "You may well ask how air we," she said bitterly. "How should a poor weak woman be farin' with a critter like Shadrach for a husband? It's a wonder I got a roof over my head or so much as a barrel of b'ar meat put up for the winter. The place is going to rack and ruin. Look at that there busted axe handle, for instance. Is a poor weak female like me got to endure such abuse?" "You don't mean to tell me Uncle Shadrach's been beating you with that axe handle?" I says, scandalized. "No," says this poor weak female. "I busted it over his head a week ago, and he's refused to mend it. It's liquor has been Shadrach's ruin. When he's sober he's a passable figure of a man, as men go. But swiggin' blue ruin has brung him to shame and degradation." "He looks fat and sassy," I says. "Beauty ain't only skin deep," she scowls. "Shadrach's like Dead Sea fruit, fair and fat-bellied to look on, but ready to dissolve in dust and whiskey fumes when prodded. Do you know where he is right now?" And she glared at me so accusingly that Captain Kidd recoiled and turned pale. "No," I says. "Whar?" "He's over at the Apache Mountain settlement a-lappin' up liquor," she snarled. "Just a-rootin' and a-wallerin' in sin and corn juice, riskin' his immortal soul and blowin' in the money he got off'n his coon hides. I had him locked in the corn crib, aimin' to plead with him and appeal to his better nature. But whilst I was out behind the corral cuttin' me a hickory club to do the appealin' with, he kicked the door loose and skun out. I know whar he's headin', to Joel Garfield's still house, which is a 'bomination in the sight of the Lord and ought to be burnt to the ground and the ashes squinched with the blood of the wicked. But I can't stand here listening to your gab. I got hominy to make. What you been wasting my time like this for? I got a good mind to tell your pap on you. You light a shuck for Apache Mountain and bring Shadrach home." "But," I said. "Don't you give me no arguments, you impertinent scoundrel," she hollered. "I should think you'd be glad to help a poor weak female critter, 'stead of wasting your time gambling and fighting in such dens of iniquity as war paint. I want you to fix some way so's to disgust Shadrach with drink for the rest of his natural life, and if you don't, you'll hear from me, you good-for-nothing—" "All right," I yelled. "All right. Anything for a little peace. I'll get him and bring him home and make a teetotaler out of him if I have to strangle the old son of a—" "How dast you use such language in front of me?" she hollered. "Ain't you got no respect for a lady? I'll be expletive blanked if I know what the expletive deleted world's coming to. Get out of here and don't show your homely mug around here again unless you got Shadrach off a rum for good." Well, if Uncle Shadrach ever took a swig of rum in his life, it was 'cause they weren't no good red corn whiskey within reach. But I didn't try to argue with Aunt Tiscosa. I lit out down the trail, feeling like I'd been tied up to an Apache stake with a whole tribe sticking red-hot Spanish daggers into my hide. Aunt Tiscosa affects a man that way. I heard Captain Kidd heave a sigh of relief plumb up from his belly, too, as we crossed a ridge, and her distant voice was drowned out by the soothing sounds of a couple of bobcats fighting with a timber wolf. I thought, what calm and happy lives them simple critters lived without no Aunt Tiscosa. I rode on, forgetting my own troubles and feeling sorry for poor Uncle Shadrach. They weren't a mean bone in his carcass. He was just as good-natured and hearty a critter as you'd ever meet, even in the Humboldts. But his main objective in life seemed to be to stow away all the corn juice they is in the world. As I rode along, I racked my brain for a plan to break Uncle Shadrach of this here habit. I like a dram myself, but in moderation, never more'n a gallon or so at a time, unless it's a special occasion. I don't believe in a man making a hog out of hisself, and anyway, I was sick and tired running Uncle Shadrach down and fetching him home from his sprees. I thought so much about it on my way to Apache Mountain that I got so sleepy I seen I was getting into no state to ride Captain Kidd. He got to looking back at me now and then, and I knowed if he seen me dozing in the saddle, he'd try his darndest to break my neck. I was passing Cousin Bill Gordon's barn about that time, so I thought I'd go in and take me a nap up in the hayloft, and maybe I'd dream about a way to make a water drinker out of Uncle Shadrach, or something. I tied Captain Kidd and started into the barn, and what should I see but Bill's 3 youngest boys engaged in daubing paint on Uncle Jeopard Grimes' favorite jackass, Joshua. "What are you all doing to Joshua?" I demanded, and they jumped back and looked guilty. Joshua was a critter which Uncle Jeopard used for a pack mule when he went prospecting. He got the urge maybe every 3 or 4 year, and between times Joshua just ate and slept. He was the sleepinest jackass I ever seen. He was snoozing now, whilst them young idiots was working on him. I seen what they was at. Bill had loaned the feller some money which had a stored down to war paint, and the feller went broke and give Bill a lot of stuff out of the store for pay. They was a lot of paint amongst it. Bill packed it home, though I don't know what he aimed to do with it, because all the houses in the Humboldts was log cabins which nobody ever painted, or if they did, they just whitewashed 'em. But anyway, he had it all stored in his barn, and his boys was smearing it on Joshua. He was the darndest sight you ever seen. They'd painted a big stripe down his spine like a Spanish Mustang, only this stripe was green instead of black, and more stripes curving over his ribs and down under his belly, red, white, and blue, and they'd painted his ears green. "What you all mean by sech doin's?" I asked. "Uncle Jeopard'll plumb skin you all alive. He sets a lot of store by that there Jack." "Aw, it's just funnin'," they said. "You won't know who done it." "You go scrub that paint off," I ordered 'em. "Joshua'll lick it off and get pisoned." "It won't hurt him," they assured me. "He got in here yesterday and et 3 cans of paint and a bucket of whitewash. That's what give us the idee. He can eat anything. Eatin'est Jack you ever seen." "Hee hee hee," snickered one of 'em. "He looks like a drunkard's dream." Instantly an idea hit me. "Gimme that jackass," I exclaimed. "He's just what I need to cure Uncle Shadrach Polk of drinking liquor. One glimpse of that there Jack in his present state, and Uncle Shadrach'll think he's got the delirious tremens, and get so scared he'll swear off whiskey for life. If you aims to lead Joshua to Joel's stillhouse, they said, you'll be all day getting there. You can't hustle Joshua. I ain't gonna lead him, I said. You all hitch a couple of mules to your pa's spring wagon. I'll leave Captain Kidd here till I get back. We'll put him in the corral behind the barn, they says. Them poles are set 4 foot deep in concrete, and the fence is braced with railroad iron. So maybe it'll hold him till you get back, if you ain't gone too long. When they got the mules hitched, I tied Joshua's legs and laid him in the wagon bed, where he went to sleep, and I climbed onto the seat and lit out for Apache Mountain. I hadn't gone far when I run over a rock and woke Joshua up, and he started braying and kept it up till I stopped and give him a ear of corn to chew on. As I started off, I seen Dick Grimes' youngest gal peeping at me from the bresh, and when I called to her, she run off. I hoped she hadn't heard Joshua braying. I knowed she couldn't see him, laying down in the wagon bed, but he had a very peculiar bray, and anybody in the Humboldts could recognize him by it. I hoped she didn't know I had Joshua, 'cause she was the derndest tattletale in the Bear Creek country, and Uncle Jeppard is such a cross-grained old cuss you can't explain nothing to him. He was born with the notion that the whole world was plotting agin him. It hadn't been much more'n good daylight when I rode past Uncle Shadrach's house, and I'd pushed Captain Kidd pretty brisk from there. The mules made good time, so it warn't noon yet when I come to Apache Mountain. As I approached the settlement, which was a number of cabins strung up and down a brushy run, I swung wide of the wagon road and took to the trails, because I didn't want nobody to see me with Joshua. It was kind of tough going, because the trails was mostly footpaths and not wide enough for the wagon, and I had to stop and pull up saplings every few yards. I was scared the noise would wake up Joshua and he'd start braying again, but that jackass could sleep through a bombardment, long as he weren't being jolted personal. I was pretty close to the settlement when I had to get out of the wagon and go ahead and break down some brush so the wheels wouldn't foul, and when I laid hold of it, a couple of figures jumped up on the other side. One was Cousin Buckner Kirby's gal, Kit, and t'othern was young Harry Braxton from the other side of the mountain, and no kin to none of us. "Oh," says Kit, kind of breathless. "What you all doing out here?" I scowled, fixing Harry with an eye which made him shiver and fuss with his gun belt. "Are your intentions, Honorable Braxton?" "I don't know what business it is of yourn," said Kit bitterly. "I makes it mine," I assured her. "If this young buck can't come sparking you at a respectable place an hour, why I figures—" "Your remarks is ignorant and insultin'," says Harry, sweating profusely, but game. "I aims to make this here young lady my wife, if it weren't for the toughest prospective father-in-law ever blighted young love's sweet dream with a number 12 boot in the seat of the pants. To put it in words of one syllable, so's even you can understand, Breckinridge," says Kit, "Harry wants to marry me, but Pap is too derned mean and stubborn to let us. He don't like the Braxtons, 'count of one of 'em skun him on a hoss swap 30 years ago." "I don't love 'em myself," I grunted. "But go on." "Well," she says, "after Pap had kicked Harry out of the house 5 or 6 times, and dusted his britches with birdshot on another occasion, we kind of got the idee he was prejudiced agin Harry. So we has to take this here method of seeing each other." "Why don't you all run off and get married anyway?" I asked. Kit shivered. "We wouldn't dare try it."
Pap might wake up and catch us, and he'd shoot Harry. I'd taken a big chance sneaking out here today. Ma and all the kids are all over visiting a few days with Aunt Washita, but Pap wouldn't let me go for fear I'd meet Harry over there. I snuck out here for a few minutes. Pap thinks I'm gathering greens for dinner, but if I don't hustle back, he'll come looking for me with a hickory gad. Aw, shucks, I said. You all gotta use your brains like I do. You leave it to me. I'll get your old man out of the way for the night and give you a chance to skip. How'll you do that? Kit asked skeptically. Never mind, I told her, not having the slightest idea how I was going to do it. I'll tend to that. You get your things ready, and you, Harry, you come along the road in a buckboard just about moonrise, and Kit'll be waiting for you. You all can get hitched over to Warpaint. Buckner won't do nothing after you're hitched. Will you, sure enough? Says Harry, brightening up. Sure I will, I assured him. Vamoose now, and get that buckboard. He hustled off, and I said to Kit, get in the wagon and ride to the settlement with me. This time tomorrow, you'll be a happy married woman, sure enough. I hope so, she said, sad-like. But I'm betting something'll go wrong and Pap'll catch us, and I'll eat my meals off the mantel board for the next week. Trust me, I assured her as I helped her in the wagon. She didn't seem much surprised when she looked down in the bed and seen Joshua all tied up and painted and snoring his head off. Humboldt folks expects me to do unusual things. You needn't look like you thought I was crazy, I says irritably. That critter is for Uncle Shadrach Polk. If Uncle Shadrach sees that thing, says she, he'll think he's seeing worse'n snakes. That's what I aim for him to think, I says. Who's he staying with? Us, says she. I says, that there complicates things a little. Whereat does he sleep? Upstairs, she says. Well, I says, he won't interfere with our elopement none. You get out of here and go on home, and don't let your pap suspect nothing. I'd be likely to, wouldn't I? Says she, and clumb down and pulled out. I'd stopped in a thicket at the edge of the settlement, and I could see the roof of Cousin Buckner's house from where I was. I could also hear Cousin Buckner bellering, Kit! Kit! Where air you? I know you ain't in the garden. If I have to come hunting you, I 'low I'll all keep your britches on, I heard Kit call. I'm a-comin'. I heard Cousin Buckner subside into grumblings and rumblings like a grizzly talking to himself. I figured he was out on the road which run past his house, but I couldn't see him, and neither he couldn't see me, nor nobody could, which might happen to be passing along the road. I unhitched the mules and tied 'em where they could graze and get water, and I hoisted Joshua out of the wagon, and taken the ropes off of his legs and tied him to a tree and fed him and the mules with some corn I'd brung from Cousin Bill Gordon's. Then I went through the bresh till I come to Joel Garfield's still house, which was maybe half a mile from there up the run. I didn't meet nobody. Joel was by hisself in the still house, for a wonder, but he was making up for lack of trade by his own personal attention to his stock. Ain't Uncle Shadrach Polk nowhere around? I asked, and Joel lowered a jug of white corn long enough to answer me. "Naw," he says, "he ain't right now. He's likely still sleeping off the souse he was on last night. He didn't leave here till after midnight," says Joel, with another pull at the jug. "And he was taking all sides of the road at onct. He'll pull in about the middle of the afternoon and start in to fillin' his hide so full he can just barely stagger back to Buckner Kirby's house by midnight or past. I bet he has a fine old time navigating them stairs Buckner's got into his house. I'd be afeared to tackle 'em myself, even when I was sober. A pole ladder's all I want to get into a loft with, But Buckner always did have highfalutin ideas. Lately he's been arguing with Uncle Shadrach to cut down on his drinking, especially when he's full hisself. Speaking of Cousin Buckner, I says, has he been around for his regular dram yet? Not yet, says Joel. He'll be in right after dinner, as usual. He wouldn't if he knowed what I knowed, I opined, because I'd thought up a way to get Cousin Buckner out of the way that night. He'd be heading for Wolf Canyon fast as he could spraddle. I'd just met Harry Braxton with a pack mule heading for there. You don't mean somebody's made a strike in Wolf Canyon? Says Joel, pricking up his ears. You never heard nothing like it, I assured him. Alder Gulch weren't nothing to this. Says Joel, absent-mindedly pouring himself a quart-sized tin cup full of corn juice. I'm an Injun if it ain't, I says, and drinking me a dram and went back to lay in the bresh and watch the Kirby house. I was well pleased with myself, 'cause I knowed what a wolf Cousin Buckner was after gold. If anything could draw him away from home and his daughter, it'd be news of a big strike. I was willing to bet my 6-shooters against a prickly pear that as soon as Joel told him the news, he'd light out for Wolf Canyon, more especially as he'd think Harry Braxton was going there too, and no chance of him sneaking off with Kit whilst the old man was gone. After a while I seen Cousin Buckner leave the house and go down the road toward the still house, and pretty soon Uncle Shadrach emerged and headed the same way. Pretty well satisfied with myself, I went back to where I left Cousin Bill's wagon, fried me 5 or 6 pounds of venison I'd brung along for provisions and ate it, and drunk at the creek, then laid down and slept for a few hours. It was right at sundown when I woke up. I went on foot through the bresh till I came out behind Buckner's cow pen and seen Kit milking. I asked her if anybody was in the house. "Nobody but me," she said, "and I'm out here. I ain't seen neither Pap nor Uncle Shadrach since they left right after dinner. Can it be your scheme is actually working out?" "Certainly," I says. "Uncle Shadrach'll be swilling at Joel's still house till past midnight, and your Pap is undoubtedly on his way toward Wolf Canyon. You get through with your chores and get ready to skip. Don't have no light in your room, though. It's just likely your Pap told off one of his relatives to lay in the bresh and watch the house, him being of a suspicious nature. We don't want to have no bloodshed. When I hear Harry's buckboard, I'll come for you. And if you hear any peculiar noises before he gets here, don't think nothing of it. It'll just be me lugging Joshua upstairs." "That critter'll bray fit to wake the dead," says she. "He won't neither," I said. "He'll go to sleep and keep his mouth shet. Uncle Shadrach won't suspect nothing till he lights him a candle to go to bed by. Or if he's too drunk to light a candle and just falls down on the bed in the dark, he'll wake up during the night sometime to get him a drink of water. He's bound to see Joshua sometime between midnight and morning. All I hope is the shock won't prove fatal. You go get ready to skip now." I went back to the wagon and cooked me some more venison, also about a dozen eggs Kit had give me along with some corn pone and a gallon of buttermilk. I managed to make a light snack out of them morsels, and then, as soon as it was good and dark, I hitched up the mules and loaded Joshua into the wagon and went slow and easy down the road. I stopped behind the corral and tied the mules. The house was dark and still. I toted Joshua into the house and carried him upstairs. I heard Kit moving around in her room, but they weren't nobody else in the house. Cousin Buckner had regular stairs in his house like what they have in big towns, like Warpaint and the like. Most folks in the Bear Creek country just has a ladder going up through a trap door, and some said they would be a jedgment on to Buckner, account of him indulging in such vain and sinful luxury. But I got to admit that packing a jackass up a flight of stairs was a lot easier than what it would have been to lug him up a ladder. Joshua didn't bray nor kick none. He didn't care what was happening to him so long as he didn't have to do no work personal. I unfastened his legs and tied a rope around his neck and t'other end to the foot of Uncle Shadrach's bunk, and give him a hat I found on a peg to chew on till he went to sleep, which I knowed he'd do pronto. I then went downstairs and heard Kit fussing around in her room, but it warn't time for Harry, so I went back out behind the corral and sot down and leaned my back agin the fence, and I reckon I must have gone to sleep. Just associating with Joshua give a man the habit. First thing I knowed, I heard a buckboard rumbling over a bridge up the draw, and knowed it was Harry coming in fear and trembling to claim his bride. The moon warn't up yet, but they was a glow above the trees on the eastern ridges. I jumped up and ran quick and easy to Kit's winder. I can move light as a cougar in spite of my size. And I said, "Kit, air you ready?" "I'm ready," she whispered, all of a tremble. "Don't talk so loud." "They ain't nothing to be scared of," I soothed her, but lowered my voice just to humor her. "Your pap is in Wolf Canyon by this time. Ain't nobody in the house but us. I've been watching out by the corral." Kit sniffed. "Weren't that you I heard come into the house while ago?" she asked. "You been dreaming," I said. "Come on, that's Harry's buckboard coming up the road." "Let me get just a few more things together," she whispered, fumbling around in the dark. That's just like a woman. No matter how much time they has aforehand, they always has something to do at the last minute. I waited by the winder, and Harry drove on past the house a few rods and tied the hoss and come back, walking light and soft and plenty pale in the starlight. "Go on out the front door and meet him," I told her. "No, wait." Because all to onct Harry had ducked back out of the road, and he jumped over the fence and come to the winder where I was. He was shaking like a leaf. "Somebody's coming up the road afoot," he says. "It's Pap," gasped Kit. Her and Harry was sure scared of the old man. They hadn't said a word above a whisper you could never have heard 3 yards away, and I was kind of suiting my voice to theirn. "Aw, it can't be," I said. "He's in Wolf Canyon. That's Uncle Shadrach coming home to sleep off his drunk, but he's back a lot earlier than what I figured he would be. He ain't important, but we don't want no delay. Here, Kit, give me that bag. Now let me lift you out of the winder. So. Now you all skin out. I'm going to climb this here tree where I can see the fun. Now get." They crope out the side gate of the yard, just as Uncle Shadrach come in at the front gate, and he never seen 'em, because the house was between 'em. They went so soft and easy, I thought if Cousin Buckner had been in the house, he wouldn't have woke up. They was hustling down the road toward the buckboard, as Uncle Shadrach was coming up on the porch and going into the hall. I could hear him climbing the stair. I could have seen him if there'd been a light in the house, because I could look into a winder in his room and one in the downstairs hall, too, from the tree where I was setting. He got into his room about the time the young folks reached their buckboard, and I seen a light flare up as he struck a match. They weren't no hall upstairs. The stairs run right up to the door of his room. He stood in the doorway and lit a candle on a shelf by the door. I could see Joshua standing by the bunk with his head down, asleep, and I reckon the light must have woke him up, 'cause he throwed up his head and give a loud and ringing bray. Uncle Shadrach turned and seen Joshua, and he let out a shriek and fell backwards downstairs. The candlelight streamed down into the hall, and I got the shock of my life. Because as Uncle Shadrach went pitching down them steps, yelling bloody murder, they sounded a bull's roar below, and out of the room at the foot of the stair came prancing a huge figure waving a shotgun in one hand and pulling on his breeches with the other. It was Cousin Buckner, which I thought was safe in Wolf Canyon. That had been him which Kit heard come in and go to bed a while before. "What's going on here?" he roared. "What you doing, Shadrach?" "Get out of my way!" screamed Uncle Shadrach. "I just seen the devil in the form of a zebra jackass. Let me out of here!" He busted out of the house and jumped the fence and went up the road like a quarter hoss, and Cousin Buckner ran out behind him. The moon was just coming up, and Kit and Harry was just starting down the road. When she seen her old man erupt from the house, Kit screeched like a scared catamount, and Buckner heard her. He whirled and seen the buckboard rattling down the road, and he knowed what was happening. He give a beller and let bam at 'em with his shotgun, but it was too long a range. "Where's my hoss?" he roared, and started for the corral. I knowed if he got straddle of that dern long-legged bay gelding of his, he'd ride them poor infants down before they went 10 miles. I jumped down out of the tree and yelled, "Hey there, Cousin Buckner! Hey, Buck!" He whirled and shot the tail off of my coonskin cap before he seen who it was. "What you mean, jumping down on me like that?" he roared. "What you doing up that tree? Where you come from?" "Never mind that," I said. "You want to catch Harry Braxton before he gets away with your gal, don't you? Don't stop to saddle a hoss. I got a light wagon hitched up behind the corral. We can run 'em down easy in that." "Let's go!" he roared, and in no time at all we was off, him standing up in the bed and cussing and waving his shotgun. "I'll have his scalp!" he roared. "I'll pickle his heart and feed it to my hound dogs. Can't you go no faster?" Them dern mules was a lot faster than I'd thought. I didn't dare hold 'em back for fear Buckner'd get suspicious, and the first thing I knowed we was overhauling the buckboard foot by foot. Harry's critters weren't much account, and Cousin Bill Gordon's mules was laying their bellies to the ground. I don't know what Kit thought when she looked back and seen us tearing after 'em, but Harry must have thought I was betraying 'em. Otherwise he wouldn't have opened up on me with his 6-shooter. But all he done was knock some splinters out of the wagon and nick my shoulder. The old man would have returned the fire with his shotgun, but he was scared he might hit Kit, and both vehicles was bounding and bouncing along too fast and furious for careful aiming. All to onst we come to a place where the road forked, and Kit and Harry taking the right-hand turn. I'd taken the left. "Are you crazy, you blame fool?" roared Cousin Buckner. "Turn back and take the other road." "I can't," I responded. "These mules is running away." "You're a liar!" howled Cousin Buckner. "Quit pouring leather onto them mules, you blasted expletive, and turn back. Turn back, cuss you!" With that he started hammering me in the head with the stock of his shotgun. We was thundering along a road which run along the rim of a sloping bluff, and when Buckner's shotgun went off accidentally, the mules really did get scared and started running away, just about the time I reached back to take the shotgun away from Cousin Buckner. Being beat in the head with the butt was getting awful monotonous, 'cause he'd been doing nothing else for the past half-mile. I yanked the gun out of his hand, and just then the left hind wheel hit a stump, and the hind end of the wagon went straight up in the air and the pole splintered. The mules run right out of the harness, and me and the wagon and Cousin Buckner went over the bluff and down the slope in a whirling tangle of wheels and legs and heads and profanity. We brung up against a tree at the bottom, and I throwed the ruins off of me and riz, swearing fervently when I saw how much money I'd have to pay Cousin Bill Gordon for his wagon. But Cousin Buckner give me no time for meditation. He'd untangled hisself from a hind wheel and was doing a war dance in the moonlight and frothing at the mouth. "You done that on purpose," he raged. "You never aimed to catch them wretches. You taken the wrong road on purpose. You turned us over on purpose. Now I'll never catch the scoundrel which run away with my dadder. The poor, dumb, trustin', expletive innercent." "Be calm, Cousin Buckner," I advised. "He'll make her a good husband. They're well onto their way to war paint and a happy married life. Best thing you can do is forgive 'em and give 'em your blessing." "Well," he snarled, "you ain't neither my daughter or my son-in-law. Here's my blessing to you." It was a poor return for all the trouble I'd taken, for him to push me into a cactus bed and hit me with a rock the size of a watermelon. However, I'd taken into consideration that he was overwrought and not himself, so I ignored his incivility and made no retort whatever outside of splintering a wagon spoke over his head. I then clomb the bluff, making no reply to his impassioned and profane comments, and looked around for the mules. They hadn't run far. I seen 'em grazing down the road, and I started after 'em, when I heard horses galloping back up the road toward the settlement, and around a turn in the road come Uncle Jepperd Grimes, with his whiskers streaming in the moonlight, and 9 or 10 of his boys riding hard behind him. "There he is!" he howled, impulsively discharging his 6-shooter at me. "There's the fiend in human form! There's the kidnapper of helpless Jassicks! Boys, do your duty!" They pulled up around me and started piling off their horses with blood in their eyes and weapons in their hands. "Hold on," I says. "If it's Joshua you fools are after—" "He admits the crime," howled Uncle Jepperd. "Is it Joshua, says you? You know darn well it is. We've been combing the hills for you ever since my granddaughter brought me the news. What you done with him, you scoundrel?" "Aw," I said, "he's all right. I was just going to—" "He evades the question!" screamed Uncle Jepperd. "Get him, boys!" "I tell you he's all right," I roared, but they give me no chance to explain. Them Grimeses is all alike. You can't tell 'em nothing. You gotta knock it into their fool heads. They descended on me with fence rails and rocks and wagon spokes and loaded quirks and gun stocks in a way which would have tried the patience of a saint. I always try to be as patient with my errand relatives as I can be. I merely taken their weapons away from 'em and kind of pushed 'em back away from me. And if they'd look where they fell, Jim and Joe and Erath wouldn't have fell down off that bluff and broke their arms and legs. And Bill wouldn't have fractured his skull agin that tree. I handled 'em as easy as babies and kept my temper in spite of Uncle Jepperd dancing around on his hoss and yelling, "Lay into him, boys! Don't be scared of the big grizzly! He can't hurt us!" and shooting at me every time he thought he could shoot without hitting one of his own offspring. He did puncture 2 or 3 of 'em and then blamed me for it, the old jackass. Nobody could have acted with more restraint than I did when Dick Grimes broke the blade of his bowie knife off on my hip bone, and the 7 fractured ribs I give his brother Jacob was a mild retaliation for chawing my ear like he done. But it was an ill-advised impulse which prompted Esau Grimes to stab me in the seat of the britches with a pitchfork. There ain't nothing which sours the milk of human kindness in a man's veins any more than getting pitchforked by a raging relative behind his back. I give a beller which shook the acorns out of the oaks, all up and down the run, and whirled on Esau so quick it jerked the pitchfork out of his hands and left it sticking in my hide. I reached back and pulled it out and wrapped the handle around Esau's neck. Then I'd taken him by the ankles and started remodeling the landscape with him. I mowed down a sapling thicket with him and leveled a cactus bed with him and swept the road with him, and when his brothers tried to rescue him, I beat 'em over the head with him till they was too groggy to do anything but run in circles. Uncle Jepperd came spurring at me, trying to knock me down with his hoss and trample me, and Esau was so limp by this time he weren't much good for a club no more, so I whirled him round my head a few times and throwed him at Uncle Jepperd. Him and Uncle Jepperd and the hoss all went down in a heap together, and from the way Uncle Jepperd hollered you'd have thought somebody was trying to injure him. It was plumb disgusting. 5 or 6 of his boys recovered enough to surge onto me then, and I knocked them all down on top of him and Esau and the hoss, and the hoss was trying to get up and kicking around right and left, and his hoofs was going bam, bam, bam on human heads, and Uncle Jepperd was hollering so loud I got to thinking maybe he was hurt or something. So I reached down in the heap and got him by the whiskers and pulled him out from under the hoss and 4 or 5 of his fool boys. "Are you hurt, Uncle Jepperd?" I inquired. "Expletive deleted," responded Uncle Jepperd, rewarding my solicitude by trying to stab me with his bowie knife. This ingratitude irritated me, and I tossed him from me fretfully, and as he was pulling himself out of the prickly pear bed where he landed, he suddenly give a louder scream than ever. Something come ambling up the road, and I seen it was that fool jackass Joshua, which had evidently ate his rope and left the house looking for more grub. He looked like a 4-legged nightmare in the moonlight, but all Uncle Jepperd noticed was the red paint on him. "Help! Murder!" howled Uncle Jepperd. "They've wounded him mortally. He's bleeding to death. Get a tourniquet, quick!" With that they all deserted the fray, them which was able to hobble, and run to grab Joshua to staunch his bleeding. But when he seen all them Grimeses coming for him, Joshua got scared and took out through the bresh. They all pelted after him, and the last thing I heard as they passed out of hearing was Uncle Jepperd wailing, "Joshua, stop, durn it! This here's your friends. Pull up, dang ye! We wants to help you, you cussed fool!" I turned to see what I could do for the casualties which lay groaning in the road and at the foot of the bluff, but they said unanimous they didn't want no help from a enemy, which they meant me. They one and all promised to pickle my heart and eat it as soon as they was able to get about on crutches. So I abandoned my efforts and headed for the settlement. The fighting had scared the mules up the road a ways, but I catched 'em and made a hackamore out of one of my galluses, and rode one and led t'other, and lit out straight through the bresh for Bear Creek. I'd had a belly full of Apache Mountain, but I swung past Joel's still house to find out how come Cousin Buckner didn't go to Wolf Canyon. When I got there the still house was dark and the door was shut, and they was a note on the door. I could read a little by then, and I spelt it out. It said, "Gone to Wolf Canyon. Joel Garfield." That selfish polecat hadn't told Cousin Buckner nor nobody about the strike. He'd got hisself a pack mule and lit out for Wolf Canyon hisself. A hell of a relative he was, Maybe doing poor cousin Buckner out of a fortune for all he knowed. A mile from the settlement I met Jack Gordon coming from a dance on t'other side of the mountain, and he said he'd seen Uncle Shadrach Polk fogging down the trail on a mule he was riding bareback without no bridle. So I thought, well, anyway, my scheme for scaring him out of a taste of liquor worked. Jack said Uncle Shadrach looked like he'd seen a herd of haints. It was about daylight when I stopped at Bill Gordon's ranch to leave him his mules. I paid him for his wagon and also for the damage Captain Kidd had did to his corral. Bill had to build a new one, and Captain Kidd had also run his prize stallion off of the ranch and chawed the ears off a longhorn bull and busted into the barn and gobbled up about $10 worth of oats. When I lit out for Bear Creek again, I warn't feeling in no benevolent mood. But, thinks I, it's worth it if it's made a water swigger out of Uncle Shadrach. It was well along toward noon when I pulled up at the door and called for Aunt Tascosa. Jedge my scandalized amazement when I was greeted by a deluge of biling water from the winder, and Aunt Tascosa stuck her head out and says, "You buzzard in the form of a human being! How you got the brass to come bugling around here? If I weren't a lady, I'd tell you just what I thought of you, you expletive blanked. Git before I opens up on you with this here shotgun." "Why, Aunt Tascosa, what you talking about?" I asked, combing the hot water out of my hair with my fingers. "You got the nerve to ask," she sneered. "Didn't you promise me you'd cure Shadrach a drinking rum? Didn't you, huh? Well, come in here and look at him. He arrived home about daylight on one of Buckner Kirby's mules, and it about ready to drop, and he's been wrastling ever since with a jug he had hid. I can't get no sense out of him." I went in, and Uncle Shadrach was sitting by the back door, and he had hold of that there jug like a drowning man clutching a straw stack. "I'm surprised at you, Uncle Shadrach," I said. "What in the—" "Shet the door, Breckinridge," he says. "They is more devils onto the earth than is dreamed of in our philosophy. I've had a narrer escape, Breckinridge. I let myself be beguiled by the arguments of Buckner Kirby, a son of Belial which is without understanding. He's been wrastling with me to give up liquor. Well, yesterday I got so tired of his arguments, I said I'd try it a while, just to have some peace. I'd never taken a drink all day yesterday, and Breckinridge, I give you my word, when I started to go to bed last night, I seen a red, white, and blue jackass with green ears standing at the foot of my bunk, just as plain as I sees you now. It were the water that done it, Breckinridge," he says, curling his fist lovingly around the handle of the jug. "Water's a snare and a delusion. I drunk water all day yesterday, and look what it done to me. I don't never want to see no water no more again." "Well," I says, losing all patience, "you're a going to, by golly, if I can heave you from here to that hoss trough in the backyard." I done it. And that's how come the rumor got started that I tried to drown Uncle Shadrach Polk in a hoss trough because he refused to swear off liquor. Aunt Tascosa was responsible for that there slander, which was a poor way to repay me for all I did for her. But people ain't got no gratitude. End of the Apache Mountain War. By Robert Howard.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pilgrims to the Pecos by Robert Howard. That there wagon rolled up the trail and stopped in front of our cabin one morning just after sunup. We all come out to see who it was, because strangers ain't common on Bear Creek, and not very often welcome neither. They was a long, hungry-looking old coot driving, and 4 or 5 growed boys sticking their heads out. "Good morning, folks," said the old coot, taking off his hat. "My name is Joshua Richardson. I'm heading a wagon train of immigrants which is looking for a place to settle. The rest of 'em's camped 3 miles back down the trail. Everybody we met in these here Humbolt Mountains told us we'd have to see Mr. Roaring Bill Elkins about settling hereabouts. Be you him?" "I'm Bill Elkins," says Pap suspiciously. "Well, Mr. Elkins," says Old Man Richardson, wagging his chin whiskers, "we'd admire it powerful if you folks would let us people settle somewheres about." Says Pap, pulling his beard. "Whar you all from?" "Kansas," says Old Man Richardson. "Wichita," says Pap. "Get my shotgun." "Don't you do no such thing, Watchy," says Ma. "Don't be stubborn, William. The war's been over for years." "That's what I say," hastily spoke up Old Man Richardson. "Let bygones be bygones, I says." "What," says Pap ominously, "is your honest opinion of General Sterling Price?" "One of nature's noblemen," declares Old Man Richardson earnestly. Says Pap. "You seem to have considerable tact and hoss sense for a red leg, but they ain't no more room on Bear Creek for no more settlers, even if they was Democrats. They's 9 or 10 families now within a retch of 100 square miles, and I don't believe in overcrowding a country." "But we're plumb tuckered out," wailed Old Man Richardson, "and nowheres to go. We have been driv from pillar to post by settlers which got here ahead of us and grabbed all the best land. They claims it whether they got any legal rights or not." "Legal rights be damned," snorted Pap. "Shotgun rights is what goes in this country. But I know just the place for you. It's 10 or 15 days' travel from here in Arizony. It's called Bowie Knife Canyon, and it's just right for farming people, which I jedge you all to be." "We be," says Old Man Richardson, "but how we gonna get there?" "My son Breckinridge will be plumb delighted to guide you there," says Pap. "Won't you, Breckinridge?" "No, I won't," I said. "Why the tarnation have I got to be picked on to ride herd on a passel of tender-footed mavericks?" "He'll get you there safe," says Pap, ignoring my remarks. "He dotes on lending folks a helping hand. Don't you, Breckinridge?" Seeing the futility of argument, I merely snarled and went to saddle Captain Kidd. I noticed Old Man Richardson and his boys looking at me in a very peculiar manner all the time, and when I come out on Captain Kidd, him snorting and bucking and kicking the rails out of the corral like he always does, they turned kind of pale, and Old Man Richardson said, "I wouldn't want to impose on your son, Mr. Elkins. After all, we wasn't intending to go to that there canyon in the first place." "I'm guiding you to Bowie Knife Canyon," I roared. "Maybe you warn't going there before I saddled my hoss, but you air now. Come on." I then cut loose under the mule's feet with my .45s to kind of put some ginger in the critters, and they brayed and sawed off down the trail, just hitting the high places, with Old Man Richardson hanging on to the lines and bouncing all over the seat, and his sons rolling in the wagon bed. We come into the camp full tilt, and some of the men grabbed their guns, and the women hollered and jerked up their kids, and one feller was so excited he fell into a big pot of beans which was simmering over a fire, and squalled out that the Injuns was trying to burn him alive. Old man Richardson had his feet braced agin the front gate, pulling back on the lines as hard as he could, and yelling bloody murder. But the mules had the bits betwixt their teeth, so I rode to their heads and grabbed them by the bridles and throwed 'em back onto their haunches. And old man Richardson ought to have knew that the stop would be sudden. 'Twarn't my fault he done a dive off the seat and hit on the wagon tongue on his head. And it weren't my fault neither that one of the mules kicked him and t'othern bit him before I could untangle him from amongst them. Mules is mean critters, howsoever you take 'em. Everybody hollered amazin', and he riz up and mopped the blood off of his face and waved his arms and hollered, "Calm down, everybody. This ain't nothin' to git excited about. This gentleman is Mr. Breckinridge Elkins, which has kindly agreed to guide us to a land of milk and honey down in Arizony." They received the news without enthusiasm. They was about 50 of them, mostly women, children, and half-grown young'uns. They weren't more'n a dozen fit fighting men in the train. They all looked like they'd been on the trail a long time, and they was all some kin to old man Richardson, sons and daughters, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, their husbands and wives, and such like. They was one real purty gal, the old man's youngest daughter Betty, who warn't yet married. They'd jest et breakfast and was hitched up when we arrove, so we pulled out without no more delay. I rode along of old man Richardson's wagon, which went ahead with the others strung out behind, and he says to me, "If this here Bowie Knife Canyon is such a remarkable place, why ain't it already been settled?" "Aw, they was a settlement there," I said, "but the Apaches killed some, and Mexican bandits killed some, and about 3 years ago the survivors got to fighting amongst theirselves and just kind of killed each other off." He yanked his beard nervously and said, I don't know. Maybe we'd ought to hunt a more peaceful spot than that there sounds like." "You won't find no peaceful spots west of the Pecos," I assured him. "Say no more about it. I've made up our minds that Bowie Knife Canyon is the place for y'all, and we're going there." "Well, I wouldn't think of arguing the p'int," he assured me hastily. "What towns does we pass on our way?" "Just one," I said. "War Smoke, right on the Arizona line. Tell your folks to keep out of it. It's a hangout for every kind of a outlaw. I judge your boys ain't handy enough with weapons to mix in sech company." "We don't want no trouble," says he. "I'll tell 'em." So we rolled along, and the journey was pretty uneventful except for the usual mishaps which generally happens to tenderfeet. But we progressed until we was within striking distance of the Arizona border, and there we hit a snag. The rear wagon bogged in a creek we had to cross a few miles north of the line. There'd been a head rise, and the wagons churned the mud, so the last one stuck fast. It was getting on toward sundown, and I told the others to go on and make camp a mile west of War Smoke, and me and the folks in the wagon would foller when we got it out. But that warn't easy. It was mired clean to the hubs, and the mules was up to their bellies. We pried and heaved and hauled, and night was coming on, and finally I said, if I could get them cussed mules out of my way, I might accomplish something. So we unhitched 'em from the wagon, but they was stuck too, and I had to wade out beside 'em and lift 'em out of the mud one by one and tote 'em to the bank. A mule is a helpless critter. But then, with them out of the way, I laid hold of the tongue and hauled the wagon out of the creek in short order. Them Kansas people sure did look surprised. I don't know why. Time we'd scraped the mud off of the wagon and us and hitched up the mules again, it was night, so it was long after dark when we come up to the camp the rest of the train had made in the place I told 'em. Old man Richardson come up to me looking worried, and he says, "Mr. Elkins, some of the boys went into that there town in spite of what I told 'em." "Don't worry," I says. "I'll go get 'em." I clumb on Captain Kidd without stopping to eat supper, and rode over to War Smoke, and tied my hoss outside the only saloon they was there.
It was a small town and awfully hard looking. As I went into the saloon, I seen the four Richardson boys, and they was surrounded by a gang of cutthroats and outlaws. They was a Mexican there too, a tall, slim cuss with a thin black mustache and gilt braid onto his jacket. "So you think you settled in Bowie Knife Canyon, eh?" he says. And one of the boys said, "Well, that's what we was aiming to do." "I think not," he said, grinning like a cougar, and I seen his hands steal to the ivory-handled guns at his hips. "You never heard of Señor Gonzales Zamora? No? Well, he is a big hombre in this country, and he has use for this canyon in his business." "Start the fireworks whenever you're ready, Gomez," muttered a white desperado. "We're backing your play." The Richardson boys didn't know what the deal was about, but they seen they was up agin real trouble, and they turned pale and looked around like trapped critters, seeing nothing but hostile faces and hands gripping guns. "Who tell you you could settle this canyon?" asked Gomez. "Who bring you here? Somebody from Kansas? Yes? No?" "No," I said, shouldering my way through the crowd. "My folks come from Texas. My granddaddy was at San Jacinto. You remember that?" His hands fell away from his guns, and his brown hide turned ashy. The rest of them renegades give back, muttering, "Look out, boys, it's Breckinridge Elkins." They all suddenly found they had business at the bar, or playing cards, or something, and Gomez found himself standing alone. He licked his lips and looked sick, but he tried to keep up his bluff. "You maybe no like what I say about Señor Zamora," says he, "but it's truth. If I tell him gringos come to Bowie Knife Canyon, he get very mad." "Well, suppose you go and tell him now," I said, and so as to give him a good start, I picked him up and throwed him through the nearest winder. He picked himself up and staggered away, streaming blood and Mex profanity, and them in the saloon maintained a kind of pallid silence. I hitched my guns forward and said to the escaped convict which was tending bar, I says, "You don't want me to pay for that winder, do you?" "Oh, no," says he, polishing away with his rag at a spittoon he must have thought was a beer mug. "Oh, no, 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 no. We needed that winder busted for the ventilation." "Then everybody's satisfied," I suggested, and all the hoss thieves and stagecoach bandits in the saloon give me a hearty agreement. "Well, that's fine," I says. "Peace is what I aim to have, if I have to lick every one in the joint to get it. You boys get back to the camp." They was glad to do so, but I lingered at the bar and bought a drink for a train robber I'd knowed at Chawed Ear onct, and I said, "Just who is this cussed Zamora that Mex was spieling about?" "I don't know," says he. "I never heard of him before." "I wouldn't say you was lying," I said tolerantly. "You're just suffering from loss of memory. Frequently cases like that is cured and their memory is restored by a severe shock or jolt, like a lick onto the head. Now then, if I was to take my 6-shooter butt and drive your head through that whiskey barrel with it, I bet it'd restore your memory right sudden. Hold on," says he in a hurry. "I just remembered that Zamora is the boss of a gang of Mexicans which claims Bowie Knife Canyon. He deals in hosses." "You mean he steals hosses," I says. And he says, "I ain't arguing. Anyway, the cabin is very convenient for his business, and if you dump them immigrants in his front yard, he'll be very much put out." "He sure will," I agreed, "as quick as I can get my hands onto him." I finished my drink and strode to the door and turned suddenly with a gun in each hand. The 9 or 10 fellers which had drawed their guns aiming to shoot me in the back as I went through the door, they dropped their weapons and throwed up their hands and yelled, "Don't shoot!" So I just shot the lights out, then went out and got on to Captain Kidd whilst them idiots was hollering and falling over each other in the dark, and rode out of War Smoke, casually shattering a few winder lights along the street as I went. When I got back to camp the boys had already got there, and the whole wagon train was holding their weapons and scared most to death. "I'm mighty relieved to see you back safe, Mr. Elkins," says old man Richardson. "We heard the shooting and was afeared them bullies had kilt you. Let's hitch up and pull out right now. Them tenderfoots is beyond my comprehension. They'd have all pulled out in the dark if I'd let 'em, and I believe most of 'em stayed awake all night, expecting to be butchered in their sleep. I didn't say nothing to them about Zamora. The boys hadn't understood what Gomez was talking about, and they weren't no use getting 'em worse scared than what they generally was. Well, we pulled out before daylight because I aimed to reach the canyon without another stop. We kept rolling and got there pretty late that night. It weren't really no canyon at all, but a whopping big valley, well timbered and mighty good water and grass. It was a perfect place for a settlement, as I pinted out, but tenderfoots is powerful peculiar. I happened to pick our campsite that night on the spot where the Apaches wiped out a mule train of Mexicans 6 years before, and it was too dark to see the bones scattered around till next morning. Old man Richardson was using what he thought was a round rock for a pillar, and when he woke up the next morning and found he'd been sleeping with his head onto a human skull, he liked to throw a fit. And when I wanted to stop for the noonday meal in that there grove where the settlers hanged them 7 cattle rustlers 3 years before, them folks got the willies when they seen some of the ropes still sticking onto the limbs, and wouldn't on no account eat their dinner there. You got no idee what peculiar folks them immigrants is till you saw some. Well, we stopped a few miles further on in another grove in the midst of a wide rolling country of plenty of trees and tall grass, and I didn't tell 'em that was where them outlaws murdered the 3 Grissom boys in their sleep. Old man Richardson said it looked like as good a place as any to locate the settlement, but I told him we was going to look over the whole dern valley before we chose the spot. He kind of wilted and said at least for God's sake let 'em rest a few days. I never seen folks which tired out so easy, but I said all right, and we camped there that night. I hadn't saw no signs of Zamora's gang since we come into the valley, and thought likely they was all off stealing hosses somewhere. Not that it made any difference. Early next morning, Ned and Joe, the old man's boys, they wanted to go look for deer, and I told them not to go more than a mile from camp and be careful, and they said they would and sought out to the south. I went back of the camp a mile or two to the creek where Jim Dornley ambushed Tom Harrigan 4 years before and taken me a swim. I stayed longer than I intended to. It was such a relief to get away from them helpless tenderfoots for a while, and when I rode back into camp I seen Ned approaching with a stranger, a young white man, which carried himself with an air of great importance. "Hey, Pap," hollered young Ned as we dismounted. "Where's Mr. Elkins? This feller says we can't stay in Bowie Knife Canyon." "Who are you?" I demanded, emerging from behind a wagon, and the stranger's eyes bugged out as he seen me. "My name's George Warren," says he. "A wagon train of us just came into the valley from the east yesterday. We're from Illinois." "And by what right does you order people out of this canyon?" I asked. "We got the fightin'est man in the world guiding us," says he. "I thought he was the biggest man in the world till I seen you. But he ain't to be fooled with. When he heard they was another train in the valley, he sent me to tell you to git. You better, too, if you got any sense." "We don't want no trouble," quavered old man Richardson. "You got a nerve," I snorted, and I pulled George Warren's hat down so the brim came off and hung around his neck like a collar, and turned him around and lifted him off the ground with a boot in the pants, then throwed him bodily onto his hoss. "Go back and tell your champeen that Bowie Knife Canyon belongs to us," I roared, slinging a few bullets around his hoss's feet, "and we gives him 1 hour to hitch up and clear out." "I'll get even for this," wept George Warren as he streaked it for his home range. "You'll be sorry, you big polecat. Just wait till I tell Mister—" I couldn't catch what else he said. "Now I bet he's mad," says old man Richardson. "We better go, after all." "Shut up!" I roared. "This here valley's ourn, and I intends to defend our rights to it to the last drop of your blood. Hitch them mules and swing the wagons in a circle. Pile your saddles and plunder betwixt the wheels. I got a idee you all fights better behind breastworks. Did you see their camp, Ned?" "No," says he, "but George Warren says it lies about 3 miles east of Iron. Me and Joe got separated, and I was swinging east round the south end of that ridge over there when I met this George Warren. He said he was out looking for a hoss before sunup and seen our camp, and went back and told their guide, and he sent him over to tell us to get out." "I'm worried about Joe," said old man Richardson. "He ain't come back." "I'll go look for him," I said. "I'll also scout their camp, and if the odds ain't more'n 10 to 1, we don't wait for them to attack. We goes over and wipes them out pronto. Then we hangs their fool sculps on our wagon bows as a warning to other such scoundrels." Old man Richardson turned pale and his knees knocked together, but I told him sternly to get to work swinging them wagons, and clumb on to Captain Kidd and lit out. Reason I hadn't saw the smoke of the Illinois camp was on account of a thick timbered ridge which lay east of our camp. I swung round the south end of that ridge and headed east, and I'd gone maybe a mile and a half when I saw a man riding toward me. When he seen me he come lickety split, and I could see the sun shining on his Winchester barrel. I cocked my .45-90 and rode toward him, and we met in the middle of an open flat. And suddenly we both lowered our weapons and pulled up, breast abreast, glaring at each other. "Breckinridge Elkins," says he. "Cousin Bearfield Buckner," says I. "Air you the man which sent that unlicked cub of a George Warren to bring me a defiance?" "Who else?" he snarled. He always had an awful temper. "Well," I says, "this here is our valley. You all got to move on." "What you mean, move on?" he yelled. "I brung them poor critters all the way from Dodge City, Kansas, where I encountered 'em being tormented by some wuthless buffalo hunters, which is no longer in the land of the living. I've led them through fire, flood, hostile Injuns, and white renegades. I promised to lead 'em into a land of milk and honey, and I been firm with 'em, even when they weakened theirselves, even when they begged on bended knee to be allowed to go back to Illinois. I wouldn't hear of it, because, as I told 'em, I knowed what was best for 'em. I had this canyon in mind all the time, and now you tells me to move on." Cousin Bearfield rolled an eye and spit on his hand. I just waited. "What sort of reply does you make to my request to go on and leave us in peace?" he goes on. "George Warren come back to camp wearing his hat brim around his neck and standing up in the stirrups because he was too sore to set in the saddle. So I set 'em fortifying the camp whilst I went forth to reconnoiter. That word I sent you I now repeats in person. You're my blood kin, but principles come first." "Me too," I said. "A Nevada Elkins principles is as lofty as a Texas Buckner's any day. I whooped you a year ago in Cougar Paw." "That's a cussed lie," gnashed he. "You taking a base advantage and land me with an oak log when I warn't expecting it." "Be that as it may," says I, ignoring the fact that you had just beamed me with a rock the size of a water bucket, "the only way to settle this dispute is to fight it out like gents. But we got to determine what weapons to use. The matter's too deep for fists." "I'd prefer butcher knives in a dark room," says he. "Only they ain't no room. If we'd just had a couple of sawed-off shotguns or good double-bitted axes. I tell you, Breck, let's tie our left hands together and work on each other with our buoys." "Nah," I says, "I got a better idea. We'll back our hosses together, then ride for the opposite sides of the flat. When we get there we'll wheel and charge back, shooting at each other with our Winchesters. Time they're empty, we'll be close enough to use our pistols, and when we've emptied them, we'll be close enough to finish the fight with our buoys." "Good idea," agreed Bearfield. "You always was a brainy, cultured sort of lobo, if you wasn't so damn stubborn. Now me, I'm reasonable. When I'm wrong, I admit it." "You ain't never admitted it so far," says I. "I ain't never been wrong yet," he roared, "and I'll carve the gizzard of the buzzard which says I am. Come on, let's get going." So we started to gallop to the opposite sides of the flat when I heard a voice hollering, "Mr. Elkins! Mr. Elkins!" "Hold on," I says. "That's Joe Richardson." Next minute Joe come tearing out of the bresh from the south on a mustang I hadn't never seen before, with a Mexican saddle and bridle on. He didn't have no hat nor shirt, and his back was crisscrossed with bloody streaks. He likewise had a cut in his scalp which dribbled blood down his face. "Mexicans!" he panted. "I got separated from Ned and rode further'n I should ought to had. About 5 miles down the canyon I run into a big gang of Mexicans, about 30 of 'em. One was that fella Gomez. Their leader was a big feller they called Zamora. They grabbed me and taken my hoss and whooped me with their quirts. Zamora said they was going to wipe out every white man in the canyon. He said his scouts had brung him news of our camp and another east of ourn, and he aimed to destroy both of 'em at one sweep. Then they all got onto their horses and headed north, except one man which I believe they left there to kill me before he followed them. He hit me with his 6-shooter and knocked me down, then put up his gun and started to cut my throat with his knife. But I wasn't unconscious like he thought, so I grabbed his gun and knocked him down with it, and jumped on his hoss and lit out. As I made for camp I heard you and this gent talking loud to each other and headed this way." "Which camp was they going for first?" I demanded. "I don't know," he said. "They talked mostly in Spanish I can't understand." "The duel'll have to wait," I says. "I'm heading for our camp." "And me for mine," says Bearfield. "Listen, let's decide it this way. The one that scuppers the most greasers wins, and the other'n takes his crowd and pulls out." "Bueno," I says, and headed for camp. The trees was dense. Them bandits could have passed either to the west or the east of us without us seeing 'em. I quickly left Joe, and about a quarter mile further on I heard a sudden burst of firing and screaming, and then silence. A bit later I bust out of the trees into sight of the camp, and I cussed earnestly. Instead of being drawed up in a circle, with the men shooting from between the wheels and holding them bandits off like I expected, them durned wagons was strung out like they was heading back north. The hosses was cut loose from some of 'em, and the mules was laying across the poles of others, shot full of lead. Women was screaming and kids was squalling, and I seen young Jack Richardson laying face down in the ashes of the campfire with his head in a puddle of blood. Old man Richardson come limping toward me with tears running down his face. "Mexicans," he blubbered. "They hit us like a hurricane just a little while ago. They shot Jack down like he was a dog. 3 or 4 of the other boys has got knife slashes or bullet marks or bruises from loaded quirt ends. As they rolled off, they yelled they'd come back and kill us all." "Why didn't you throw them wagons round like I told you?" I roared. "We didn't want no fighting," he bawled. "We decided to pull out of the valley and find some more peaceful place. And now Jack's dead and your stock scattered," I raged, "just because you didn't want to fight. What the hell you ever crossed the Pecos for if you didn't aim to fight nobody? Set the boys together in such stock as you got left." "But them Mexicans taken Betty!" he shrieked, tearing his scanty locks. "Most of 'em headed east, but 6 or 7 grabbed Betty right out of the wagon and rode off south with her, driving the hosses they stole from us." "Well, get your weapons and follow me," I roared. "For Lord's sake, forget they is places where sheriffs and policemen protects you, and make up your minds to fight. I'm going after Betty." I headed south as hard as Captain Kidd could run. The reason I hadn't met the Mexicans as I rode back from the flat where I met Cousin Bearfield was because they swung round the north end of the ridge when they headed east. I hadn't gone far when I heard a sudden burst of firing off to the east and figured they'd hit the Illinois camp. But I reckoned Bearfield had got there ahead of 'em. Still, it didn't seem like the shooting was far enough off to be at the other camp. But I didn't have no time to study it. Them gal thieves had a big start, but it didn't do no good. I hadn't rode over 3 miles till I heard the stolen hosses running ahead of me, and in a minute I bust out into an open flat and seen 6 Mexicans driving them critters at full speed, and one of 'em was holding Betty onto the saddle in front of him. It was that blasted Gomez. I come swooping down onto him with a 6-shooter in my right hand and a bowie knife in my left. Captain Kidd needed no guiding. He'd smelt blood and fire, and he come like a hurricane on Judgment Day, with his mane flying and his hoofs burning the grass. The Mexicans seen I'd ride 'em down before they could get across the flat, and they turned to meet me, shooting as they come. But Mexicans always was rotten shots. As we come together, I let bam 3 times with my .45, and 3, says I. One of 'em rode at me from the side and clubbed his rifle and hit at my head, but I ducked and made one swipe with my bowie. 4, says I. Then the others turned and hightailed it, letting the stolen hosses run where they wanted to. One of 'em headed south, but I was crowding Gomez so clost he whirled round and lit a shuck west. "Keep back, or I kill the girl!" he howled, lifting a knife, but I shot it out of his hand and he gave a yowl and let go of her and she fell off into the high grass. He kept fogging it. I pulled up to see if Betty was hurt, but she warn't, just scared. The grass cushioned her fall. I seen her pap and sech of the boys as was able to ride was all coming at a high run, so I left her to them and taken in after Gomez again. Pretty soon he looked back and seen me overhauling him, so he reached for his Winchester, which he'd evidently just thought of using, when about that time his hoss stepped into a prairie dog hole and throwed him over his head. Gomez never twitched after he hit the ground. I turned around and rode back, cussing disgustedly, because Elkins is ever truthful, and I couldn't honestly count Gomez in my record. But I thought I'd scuttle that coyote that runs south, so I headed in that direction. I hadn't gone far when I heard a lot of hosses running somewhere ahead of me and to the east, and then presently I bust out of the trees and come onto a flat which run to the mouth of a narrow gorge opening into the main canyon. On the left wall of this gorge mouth they was a ledge about 50 foot up, and they was a log cabin on that ledge with loopholes in the walls. The only way up onto the ledge was a log ladder, and about 20 Mexicans was running their hosses toward it across the flat. Just as I reached the edge of the bushes, they got to the foot of the wall and jumped off their hosses and run up that ladder like monkeys, letting their hosses run anyways. I seen a big feller with gold ornaments on his sombrero, which I figured was Zamora, but before I could unlimber my Winchester, they was all in the cabin and slammed the door. The next minute, Cousin Bearfield busted out of the trees a few hundred yards east of where I was and started recklessly across the flat. Immediately, all them Mexicans started shooting at him, and he grudgingly retired into the brush again with terrible language. I yelled and rode toward him, keeping to the trees. "How many you got?" he bellered as soon as he seen me. "4," I says, and he grinned like a timber wolf and says, "I got 5. I was riding for my camp when I heard the shooting behind me, so I knowed it was your camp they hit first. I turned round to go back and help you out. When did I ever ask you for any help?" I bristled. But he said, "But pretty soon I seen a gang of Mexicans coming round the north end of the ridge, so I taken cover and shot 5 of 'em out of their saddles. They must have knowed it was me because they hightailed it." "How could they know that, you conceited jackass?" I snorted. "They run off because they probably thought a whole gang had ambushed 'em." Old man Richardson and his boys had rode up whilst we was talking, and now he broke in with some heat and said, "That ain't the question. The pint is we got 'em hemmed up on that ledge for the time being, and can get away before they come down and massacre us." "What you talking about?" I roared. "They're the ones which is in need of getting away. If any massacreeing is did around here, we does it." "It's flying in the face of Providence," he bleated. But I told him sternly to shut up, and Bearfield says, "Send somebody over to my camp to bring my warriors." So I told Ned to go, and he pulled out. Then me and Bearfield studied the situation, setting our horses in the open whilst bullets from the cabin whistled all around us, and the Richardsons hid in the brush and begged us to be careful. "That ledge is sheer on all sides," says Bearfield. "Nobody couldn't climb down onto it from the cliff, and anybody trying to climb that ladder in the teeth of 20 Winchesters would be plumb crazy." But I says, "Look, Bearfield, how the ledge overhangs about 10 foot to the left of that ladder. A man could stand at the foot of the bluff there, and them coyotes couldn't see to shoot him." "And," says Bearfield, "he could sling his rope up over that spur of rock at the rim, and they couldn't shoot it off. Only way to get to it would be to come out of the cabin and reach down and cut it with a knife. Door opens toward the ladder, and there ain't no door in the wall on that side. A man could climb right up onto the ledge before they knowed it, if they didn't shoot him through the loopholes as he come over the rim." "You stay here and shoot 'em when they tries to cut the rope," I says. "You go to hell!" he roared. "I see through your hellish plot. You aims to git up there and kill all them Mexes before I has a chance at 'em. You thinks you'll outwit me. By golly, I got my rights and—" "Aw, shut up," I says disgustedly. "We'll both go." I hollered to Old Man Richardson, "You all lay low in the bresh and shoot at every Mex which comes out of the cabin." "What you going to do now?" he hollered. "Don't be rash." But me and Bearfield was already heading for the ledge at a dead run. This move surprised the Mexicans because they knowed we couldn't figure to ride our hosses up that ladder. Being surprised, they shot wild, and all they done was graze my sculp and nick Bearfield's ear. Then, just as they began to get their range and start trimming us close, we swerved aside and thundered in under the overhanging rock. We clumb off and tied our horses well apart, otherwise they'd have started fighting each other. The Mexicans above us was yelling most amazing, but they couldn't even see us, much less shoot us. I whirled my lariat, which is plenty longer and stronger than the average lasso, and roped the spur of rock which jutted up just below the rim. "I'll go up first," I says, and Bearfield showed his teeth and drawed his bowie knife. "You won't neither," says he. "We'll cut cards. High man wins." So we squatted, and Old Man Richardson yelled from the trees, "For God's sake, what are you doing now? They're fixing to roll rocks down onto you." "You tend to your own business," I advised him, and shuffled the cards which Bearfield hauled out of his breeches. As it turned out, the Mexes had a supply of boulders in the cabin. They just opened the door and rolled them toward the rim, but they shot off the ledge and hit beyond us. Bearfield cut and yelped, "A ace! You can't beat that." "I can equal it," I says, and drawed an ace of diamonds. "Ah, wins!" he clamored. "Hearts beats diamonds." "That rule don't apply here," I says. "It were a draw, and—" "Why, you—" says Bearfield, leaning forward to grab the deck, and just then a rock about the size of a bushel basket come bounding over the ledge and hit a projection, which turned its course, so instead of shooting over us, it fell straight down and hit Bearfield smack between the ears. It stunned him for an instant, and I jumped up and started climbing the rope, ignoring more rocks which was thundering down. I was about halfway up when Bearfield came to, and he riz with a beller of rage. "Why, you dirty double-crossing so-and-so," says he, and started throwing rocks at me. They was a awful racket, the Mexicans howling, guns banging, Bearfield cussing, and Old Man Richardson wailing. "They're crazy, I tell you. They're both crazy as mud hens. I think everybody west of the Pecos must be maniacs." Bearfield grabbed the rope and started climbing up behind me, and about that time one of the Mexicans run to cut the rope. But for once my idiotic followers was on the job. He run into about 7 bullets that hit him all to once, and fell down just above the spur where the loop was caught onto. So when I reached my arm over the rim to pull myself up, they couldn't see me on account of the body. But just as I was pulling myself up, they let go of a boulder at random, and it bounded along and bounced over the dead Mexican and hit me right smack in the face. It was about as big as a pumpkin. I give an infuriated beller and swarmed up onto the ledge, and it surprised 'em so that most of 'em missed me clean. I only got one slug through the arm. Before they had time to shoot again, I made a jump to the wall and flattened myself between the loopholes, and grabbed the rifle barrels they poked through the loopholes and bent 'em and ruined 'em. Bearfield was coming up the rope right behind me, so I grabbed hold of the logs and tore that whole side of the wall out, and the roof fell in and the other walls come apart. In an instant all you could see was logs falling and rolling, and Mexicans busting out into the open. Some got pinned by the fallen logs, and some was shot by my embattled Kansans and Bearfield's Illinois warriors, which had just come up, and some fell off of the ledge and broke their fool necks. One of 'em run agin me and tried to stab me, so I throwed him after them, which had already fell off the ledge, and hollered, "5 for me, Bearfield." "Expletive deleted," says Bearfield, arriving onto the scene with blood in his eye and his bowie in his hand. Seeing which, a big Mexican made for him with a butcher knife, which was poor judgment on his part, and in about the flick of a mustang's tail, Bearfield had a 6th man to his credit.
Now this made me mad. I seen some of the Mexicans was climbing down the ladder, so I run after them, and one turned around and missed me so close with a shotgun he burnt my eyebrows. I taken it away from him and hit him over the head with it and yelled, "Six for me too, Cousin Bearfield." "Look out," he yelled. "Zamora's getting away." I seen Zamora had tied a rope to the back side of the ledge and was sliding down it. He dropped the last 10 feet and run for a corral which was full of hosses back up the gorge behind the ledge. We seen the other Mexicans was all laid out or running off up the valley, pursued by our immigrants. So I went down the ladder and Bearfield slid down my rope. Zamora's rope wouldn't have held our weight. We grabbed our hosses and lit out up the gorge, around a bend of which Zamora was just disappearing. He had a fast hoss and a long start, but I'd a overtook him within the first mile, only Captain Kidd kept trying to stop and fight Bearfield's hoss, which was about as big and mean as he was. After we'd run about 5 miles and come out of the gorge onto a high plateau, I got far enough ahead of Bearfield so Captain Kidd forgot about his hoss. Then he settled down to business and run Zamora's hoss right off his legs. They was a steep slope on one side of us and a 500-foot drop on the other, and Zamora seen his hoss was winded, so he jumped off and started up the slope on foot. Me and Bearfield jumped off too and run after him. Each one of us got him by a leg as he was climbing up a ledge. "Let go my prisoner," roared Bearfield. "He's my meat," I snarled. "This makes me 7. I wins." "You lie," bellowed Bearfield, jerking Zamora away from me and hitting me over the head with him. This made me so mad I grabbed Zamora and throwed him in Bearfield's face. His spurs jabbed Bearfield in the belly, and my cousin give a maddened beller and fell on me fist and tush. And in the battle which followed, we forgot all about Zamora till we heard a man scream. He'd snuck away and tried to mount Captain Kidd. We stopped fighting and looked around just in time to see Captain Kidd kick him in the belly and knock him clean over the edge of the cliff. "Well," says Bearfield disgustedly, "that decides nothing, and our score is a draw." "It was my hoss which done it," I said. "It ought to count for me." "Over my corpse it will," roared Bearfield. "But look here, it's nearly night. Let's get back to the camps before my followers start cutting your Kansans' throats. Whatever fight is to be fought to decide who owns the canyon, it's betwixt you and me, not them." "All right," I said. "If my Kansas boys ain't already killed all your idiots, we'll fight this out somewhere where we got better light and more room. But I just expect to find your Illinoisans writhing in their gore." "Don't worry about them," he snarled. "They're as wild as painters when they smell gore. I only hope they ain't killed all your Kansas mavericks." So we pulled for the valley. When we got there it was dark, and as we rode out of the gorge, we seen fires going on the flat, and folks dancing around them, and fiddles was going at a great rate. "What the hell is this?" bellowed Bearfield. And then old man Richardson come up to us, overflowing with good spirits. "Glad to see you gents," he says. "This is a great night. Jack weren't killed after all, just creased. We come out of that great fight whole and sound." "But what you doing?" roared Bearfield. "What's my people doing here?" "Oh," says old man Richardson, "we got together after you gents left and agreed the valley was big enough for both parties, so we decided to jine together into one settlement and we're celebrating. Them Illinois people is fine folks. They're as peace-loving as we are." "Bloodthirsty painters," I sneers to Cousin Bearfield. "I ain't no bigger liar than you air," he says, more in sorrow than in anger. "Come on. They ain't nothing more we can do. We air swamped in a mess of pacifism. The race is degenerating. Let's head for Bear Creek. This atmosphere of brotherly love is more'n I can stand." We sat our hosses there a minute and watched them pilgrims dance and listened to 'em singing. I squints across at
Cousin Barefield's face, and doggone if it didn't look almost human in the firelight. He hauls out his plug of tobacco and offers me first chaw. Then we headed yonderly, riding stirrup to stirrup. Must have been 10 miles before Captain Kidd retches over and bites Cousin Barefield's hoss on the neck. Barefield's hoss bites back, and by accident Captain Kidd kicks Cousin Barefield on the ankle. He lets out a howl and thumps me over the head, and I hit him, and then we gets our arms around each other and roll in the bresh in a tangle. We fit for 2 hours, I reckon, and we'd been fighting yet if we hadn't scrambled under Captain Kidd's hoofs where he was feeding. He kicked Cousin Barefield one way and me the other. I got up after a while and went hunting my hat. The brush crackled, and in the moonlight I could see Cousin Barefield on his hands and knees. "Where are ye, Cousin Breckinridge?" says he. "Air you all right?" Well, maybe my clothes was torn more'n his was, and a lip split and a rib or two busted, but I could still see, which is more'n he could say, with both of his eyes swole that way. "Sure I'm all right," I says. "How are you, Cousin Barefield?" He let out a groan and tried to get up. He made her on the second heave and stood there swaying. "Why, I'm fine," he says. "Plumb fine. I feel a whole lot better, Breck. I was afraid for a minute back there, whilst we was riding along, that daggone brotherly love would turn out to be catching." End of Pilgrims to the Pecos.